Last weekend, in the midst of our wintry weather and storm, we gathered to celebrate the apex of our Christian lives, where we remembered the passion, the death, and then the glorious resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. And throughout this past week, the Church has continued this celebration as we have lived what she calls the octave of Easter. For 8 days, beginning last Sunday and concluding tomorrow evening, the Church celebrates each of these days, at least liturgically, as if it were Easter Sunday. It is that recognition by the Church that the miracle, the mystery, and the gift of Easter, and the new life that it brings to us and the Church, is too great a mystery to be able to be lived and celebrated in just a day. And so the Church gives to us these 8 days to celebrate the miracle of the resurrection of our Lord. And throughout this week, as we have been celebrating our Sunday and our daily masses, in our gospel, we have been hearing of some of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to the apostles and the disciples. And this evening, in our gospel from St. John, we hear not one, but 2 of these post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. The first happens on the first night of Jesus' resurrection, Easter Sunday, and the second happens a week later. And as we reflect upon these 2 appearances of the risen Jesus to the apostles, it has always struck me that Jesus in his risen form remained with his wounds, his scars that he had received through his passion and death on the cross. It seems a bit strange that the risen Jesus, who is now transfigured in this new resurrected body, would still have these scars on his hands, on his side. You would think that if Jesus could raise himself from the dead, couldn't he have erased the scars? You would think that if Jesus is able to walk through locked doors, as we hear in our gospel tonight, that he could erase his wounds. And it is true that Jesus certainly did have the power and the ability, if he had desired, to erase those wounds and to come back with a perfect body in his resurrected state. But I think Jesus purposely chose not to do so, because these wounds, the wounds on his hand, the wound on his side, would act as his personal signature of who he was and what he did for his apostles, for the Church, for all of the world. And so tonight we hear that it was only when the apostles saw the scars in Jesus' hand on that first Easter Sunday night that they came to fully realize and accept that Jesus, in fact, was risen, was raised from the dead. They had heard earlier in the day from the women that Jesus was not in the tomb, that it was empty. They had heard that he appeared to Mary Magdalene, but their limited ability could not understand to be able to reconcile what they saw on Good Friday and what they placed in the empty tomb was now alive and risen. It was only when they came to see Jesus' wounds on his hands and his side that they came to believe. But we hear that Thomas, one of the 12, was not with them on that first Easter Sunday night for some reason. And when he is told that Jesus is alive, that they had seen and spoken with him, what does Thomas say? Unless I can place my hand in the nails on his hand and on his side, I will not believe. And we hear that 8 days later, Jesus returns. Thomas is with them. And Jesus says, do you want to place your hands in my hand? Do you want to place your hand in my side? And Thomas no longer needs to do so. And he comes to that great declaration of faith, my Lord and my God. And so why is it then that Jesus chose to retain his scars, his wounds? I think that there are at least 3 reasons why Jesus purposely did so. Firstly, the risen Jesus, I believe, kept his scars as evidence of his love for them, for all people, for the life of the world. These wounds, these scars that Jesus had would cement for them his unconditional love that he had for them, that he often spoke about during his public ministry, and that as he witnessed in his great miracles to those that he encountered. Recall even on the night before Jesus died, when he gathered for his Last Supper with his friends, St. John told us, having loved his own who are in the world, he loved them to the end. The scars on his hands and his side were that mark of the unconditional love of Jesus, so that they and we could never forget all that Jesus was willing to do, to lay down his life for the sake of others. I think the second reason that Jesus retained the scars on his hands and his side was to help us to be able to keep his passion and his death joined with his glorious resurrection. There can be a tendency within us, both with what Jesus lived and in our own lives, to want to fast forward in the midst of suffering and sacrifice and only get to the glory, to the resurrection. But by Jesus retaining the scars on his body, he reminded the church that we cannot have an Easter Sunday without a Good Friday. He reminded them that suffering leads to resurrection and newness of life, and that through pain comes the glory of the resurrection. And so Jesus' wounds were a reminder to them and to us of how it is that it is necessary for us to embrace sacrifice and suffering to be able to attain newness of life. And then, finally, I think the third reason that Jesus retained his scars after his resurrection was that they were to serve as a promise to the church and to each and every one of us. The risen Christ showed his scars to illustrate to us that through him it is possible for us, in the midst of our wounds, in the midst of our scars, to find healing and spiritual victory. The scars of the risen Christ remind us that in the midst of our brokenness, in the midst of our woundedness, in the midst of our suffering, whether it be physical or emotional or spiritual or relational, that we are not alone in the midst of what we are living and in what we are suffering, that Jesus is with us in a very real and tangible way, and that he knows what it is to suffer and sacrifice. And so he unites his suffering with ours, and we are called to unite our suffering with his. And so the scars of the risen Jesus remind us that victory and newness of life comes from our faithfulness and fidelity to God's will, even when it is difficult, even in trying times, even it involves suffering and pain. For that suffering and pain can be transformed to glory and newness of life. The scars of the risen Jesus then give us the strength day by day to bear our own scars and wounds. And so this evening, as we gather in the midst of this octave of Easter, as we gather on this Divine Mercy Sunday, we are reminded of the power and the gift of the resurrection of Jesus, but that his resurrection came from his death on the cross. And it is in and through the cross that we glory in Jesus Christ. For in and through the cross, we are saved and set free. The scars then of Jesus give us hope, give us strength, give us confidence that through him, our wounds day by day can be healed, and that they can even become places of strength and grace for us and others. Recently, I heard an author, and he said, "Our scars are a witness to the world. They are a part of our story. Healed wounds are symbols that God has restored us. The miracle and the mystery of the resurrection reminds us that the cross is not a tree of defeat, but in fact is a tree of victory. The cross reminds us that it is not an end, but in fact it is a new beginning. And so as we continue to celebrate the joy of the resurrection, as we come face to face with our own wounds and scars, we know that we are not alone, but that we can unite them to the sufferings of Christ. And through that uniting, he can bring to us newness of life and glory, both in this world and in the world to come.